Now, back there in 1948, the Second World War had only ended by 3 years. A Swedish research ship named the Albatross had just returned from a peaceful expedition in the South Atlantic. And if you went into Sweden a little while later and you peeked through the lattice windows of a house there, just outside the capital city of Stockholm, you would have seen some people huddled over a map, and you would have heard them engaging in very vigorous talk. It's incredible, said one of them. You know, we were sounding the seabed 700 miles east of Brazil, and we brought up core samples of freshwater plants. Can you believe that? Way, way down at the bottom of the ocean, freshwater plants. Do you know how deep these were? 3,000 metres. That's pretty deep, isn't it? About 10,000 feet. These samples actually contain twigs and trees and tree bark. The man who led the expedition was a man called Professor Hans Petersen. He said, I cannot explain it, except that the land must have sunk on that spot 10,000 feet, 3,000 metres. Around about the same time, a discussion was going on in London. And there had been another expedition going out into a site in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. And from depths of over 3,000 feet, that's 1,000 metres, they had brought up coral. Now, coral only grows in shallow water, very close to sea level. So in London, someone else was making a diagnosis about something similar. Either the seabed dropped thousands of feet, or the sea rose mightily. We now go across the United States, and at Columbia University, there was another discussion going on with Professor Morris Ewing, prominent marine geologist. And he was reporting on an expedition down near the Falkland Islands, just off South America in the South Atlantic. And they'd descended down there and had also been up in the northern part and found something similar. They'd gone down to submerged plateaus. And he reported, at a depth of 5,000 feet, that's 1,500 metres, we discovered ancient beach sand. As we all know, sandy beaches form from waves as they break on the edge of the shore, isn't that right? Beach sand does not come from deep down on the ocean bottom. And then Dr. Ewing dropped this bombshell. He said either the land must have sunk 2 or 3 miles down, or the sea must have been 2 or 3 miles lower and now come up. Either conclusion is startling. And this was written up in the National Geographic magazine in November 1949. Now what does this mean? Well, there's 2 possibilities. One, either the land has sunk down suddenly from its original seafloor, or, and by the way, if you explore under the seabed, you'll find even undersea canyons and rivers that are now covered with seawater, and undersea deltas that could only have been formed by rivers above sea level forming. Now they're way, way down under the ocean. And these show very sharp, fine profiles, not something that would take millions of years to drop down slowly and then get eroded slowly, but they're still very, very sharp, as though they sank suddenly. Underneath the ocean, sharp, fine profiles. And this actually is an actual photograph of an underwater canyon. Now, if the land had sunk slowly, these sharp profiles would have been eroded away even by the surf, that's sure. The evidence, therefore, does not show that the land has sunk slowly, but rather very suddenly. And that would mean a cataclysmic disaster, some great catastrophe. And this is perfectly in keeping with the Bible flood and with the centuries-old adjustments that occurred after the flood. This can be explained very, very satisfactorily this way and by no other means. The second alternative is that the pre-flood sea level must have been lower, perhaps down here, whereas today it's up here. So we've got either the land sinking suddenly before it has a chance to erode, or rising, the sea level rising a great deal. Several thousand feet, in fact. Now, that the sea has shrunk, or rather that the land has shrunk and that the sea level has increased, is an option to explain this, that there was less seawater in the ocean at one time. Now, these discoveries taking place all over the world do suggest that we're uncovering evidence of a former sea level. And the question that needs to be asked is, where did all the water that we have in our oceans come from if it was so much lower in the past? Obviously, melting ice sheets would never have contained enough water to raise the ocean level thousands of feet. We know that to be sure. So we can forget about melting ice sheets being the cause of the water in our oceans. Now, here is another surprise. This time we come to the Pacific Ocean, our own ocean. And just off the coast of South America, the research vessel entombed was exploring underwater in what's called the Nazca Trench off the coast of Ecuador. And they had sounding equipment which gave them the profile of the bottom of the ocean. And the sonar operator suddenly called for the captain. He said, I don't know what to make of this. Around here the ocean floor is all mud bottom, but just take a look at these unusual shapes. So they lowered a camera. And at a depth of 6,000 feet, that's almost 2,000 metres, they saw the remains of man-made shapes. Do you see the pillars there? Now, this is something like it. This is not the actual photograph of that spot. This is exactly what they were looking at though. And this gives a much better idea of what they were seeing. Here on the sea floor, 1,500 metres below the sea level, there was the remains of a city, right there on the floor of the ocean. Now, a few years ago, I had the privilege of flying with Dick Smith down to the Antarctic. You've all heard of Dick Smith? Well, you've heard of his shopping tent, haven't you? Okay. And 3 or 4 of us went down, and we flew down over what is known as the French Antarctic area. And I remembered as we were flying down, in fact I told Dick, I said, listen, a few years ago the French government passed a law about military service. And they exempted the inhabitants of Adelie land from military service. And at that time, the only inhabitants who would be eligible for military service in Adelie land were penguins. And they were exempted by French law from having to go into the army. What what politicians have to do with their time when they've got to pass laws like that. Okay. So we were flying over the French base. That's the French base there in Adelie land. It's on a series of little rocky islands. And we looked down from our plane. You know what happened? In fact, the plane dipped down very, very low. And we skimmed over the water at a low height. And there, would you believe it, was a water skier. In brilliant sunshine, in many degrees below zero temperature, water skiing around the ice. Can you ever imagine that? Now, this is a bleak and deadly land. That's not the water skier. And the water skier could not dry up under a tropical palm when he came on the beach. Not in Antarctica, you can't do that. But there's definite evidence that at one time our planet had a subtropical climate from Antarctica up to the North Pole. The whole climate was warm and subtropical. In fact, down in Antarctica, where it's now frozen ice, they're finding remains of coral, which only grows in warm water. Also, coal seams. Now, coal seams are the remains of an ancient forest, trees that have turned to coal. So trees used to grow down in the Antarctic where there's now only ice. And these remains were found in the Antarctica, the ones I just showed you. Remains of redwood forests have been found down there under the ice. And Admiral Richard Byrd, who's heard of Admiral Richard Byrd? Some of you have, yes. This great American man who went down and did a lot of exploring. He actually found the remains of palm trees under the ice. His expedition did. Now up in Spitsbergen, which is away up in the land of the frozen north, today that's what it looks like. And by the way, have you heard of the land of the midnight sun? Where at midnight the sun is still shining, and people go shopping in daylight, 11 o'clock at night. That's where there's a town. How about that, eh? This is where the sun, for 6 months of the year, never really sets, and then sunset. The sun comes down close to the horizon and then starts climbing again. The lowest spot is called sunset. And in the winter time, it's the opposite. The sun never rises above the horizon, but it gets a little bit close and it gets a bit brighter and then it starts going down again. So 6 months of the year it's daytime, 6 months of the year it's nighttime. That's that part of the year where Spitsbergen is and the frozen north. Do you know that up in this area they have been finding remains of fruit trees with the fruit still on there, frozen? Now, how did that happen? They were frozen before they had time to go bad. The climate must have changed suddenly. Here were trees growing. Then there was ice and frozen mud. All these kinds of fruits have been found up there around Spitsbergen, yet nothing will grow there today, let alone even grass. Flowers as well, magnolia, nuts, all these things, water lilies. And they'd envy your garden, wouldn't they, watch it? These people today don't even have any more than hunting gear for polar bears, fish, because they can't grow anything. Now, here we have today the Antarctic, which is frozen, and the North, which is frozen, and yet these used to be very tropical or subtropical. And there's evidence that the whole world was once able to grow everything. Now, who'd like to read Genesis chapter 1:31?
God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good.
Yes, this whole world was once a beautiful world, everything about it. And the first man and woman placed in this world knew it was a good world. But there's evidence that the whole earth was very different from the earth we have now. There were no ice caps, no blizzards or freezing cold, no deadly heat waves, well, even the trees according to the dogs, no enormous wastelands, no huge mountains. Now the mountains, there were mountains, but the mountain ranges were not the same height of living walls we have today. They were much lower, and they did not seriously affect the climate. Today we have climatic zones only because the mountains bar the movement of the winds. The ocean beds were shallower than they are today. The Bible says that the oceans were swarming with life, so there was still plenty of room for them. The land distribution. Now today we have 70% sea surface and 30% land, isn't that right? And when you think of the land, less than half of it is suitable for habitation, 10% of it is forest lands, and 40% is unsuitable for habitation totally, and only half of that, half of the 30% is suitable to live in. So it's a very minimised living area now, isn't it? Compared with the 100% it must have been. And if you count the volume of seawater against the volume of land above sea level, the seawater is 18 times more than the land volume. Okay, now there's evidence that the land and water areas were once more evenly distributed with more land than water. There's good evidence for this. The land was partitioned by narrow seas. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you look at parts of the world, for example, Africa and South America, they seem to fit in rather well. And if you examine the fossils that have been buried by floodwaters in South America, and you put that against Africa, the same fossils are found here in those areas. It does suggest that those two continents were once joined together. As a matter of fact, you can do that with virtually all the continents, and you will find that there's good evidence, apart from this, that at one time there was one great continental mass. Now, the fact that there's now a lot of continents, or 6 or 7 continents, has led to the idea by scientists that there has been a continental drift. And evolutionists, those who don't believe in the Bible story of creation, they speculate that this must have occurred over millions of years because it couldn't ever happen quickly. Everything would then happen slow. If land sinks, it happens slowly. But we found that's not possible, but what we found under the sea. Or it rises slowly. And continents must have separated slowly, and therefore it must have taken millions and millions of years. That's what they try to tell us. But friends, the evidence does not show that. It could just have happened suddenly, just as well, through some massive upheaval. We know these upheavals have taken place. Now, as we study the ocean floor, it shows us that the land masses have truly been ripped apart. There used to be one continental landmass, and the pieces, if you try to fit them together, they'll fit just like a jigsaw puzzle. If you take the continental shelves of each continent, they'll join together almost perfectly. And the small amount of erosion between the matching lines between the continents suggests that not millions of years, but something that happened fairly recently and has not had time to erode away very much. Now, the Bible tells us something about the world before the flood. Who'd like to read Genesis 1, 9 or 10? Anyone?
The waters were gathered into one place, contrasting with the dry land.
That's what Genesis tells us. That's interesting, isn't it? Okay, now, it tells us something else. That there were underground water basins. Today, these can be recognised, and scientists say that there are still some under the earth. Others have disappeared, that they're now filled with water-laid sediment, which I would suggest occurred during the flood. Now, the Bible talks about this when it mentions the, who'd like to read that text? Fountains of the great sea. Thank you. Scientists today call these geosynclines. Now, Genesis talks about one central river system that branched into 4 rivers which extended and encircled areas of land. It must have been a really beautiful, lush, fertile land. And the warm water currents were able to contribute to a mild climate everywhere. Now, in a world like this, there would be no winds, no storms, no rain. Cyclonic winds did not occur. Winds and storms would have been impossible. And the Bible says that there was no rain. That's in Genesis 2, verse 5. We'll see how this was all possible shortly, that there would be no rain and no great winds. Well, actually, as far as winds go, wind is largely a result of a difference in temperature between hot and cold in different areas. And that sets the winds moving. But if there was a subtropical climate from pole to pole, there would be no great winds. The temperature would be even, like it is in a terrarium or a glass house. And the Bible says, who'd like to read this one?
We have the mist on the earth and watered the whole face of the ground.
Thank you. That's how the earth was watered, by a mist, not by rain. Now, let's look at the vegetation and animal life of this ancient world. There was a lot of wonderful life in that pre-flood world. It was a beautiful world. And so we'll read again the statement in Genesis 1:31. Holman, would you like to read that, please? Thank you. Now, there would be no need for a weather forecaster. Remember when I was living in Australia, the television weather forecaster had to apologise one night. He said, I told you last night in the weather report that there was going to be no rain. And I got home and watered my garden, and a few minutes later it poured down. Today we don't really have a real clue as to what the weather's going to be. It can change several times in a day, can't it? And so if somebody came and said, I'd like to be a weather forecaster, will you give me a job before the time of the flood? He'd be laughed out of town. Okay. Because it was not necessary to predict the weather. Everybody knew what the weather was going to be like tomorrow. It was always calm and fine and pleasant. It was like living under a dome. Who'd like to read Genesis 1:7?
Genesis speaks of a water above the firmament.
Thank you. Now this Hebrew word translated firmament means expanse, referring to the atmosphere. And the Bible says there was waters above the atmosphere. Now that's interesting. Now there was a protective water canopy above the atmosphere. On other planets, this same phenomenon is known to exist. For example, the planet Venus, Jupiter, Saturn's moon Titan, they all have vapour or cloud canopies surrounding them. And such a canopy would diffuse the sun's rays all over the earth and would also give the world a uniform climate. It would shelter the earth's environment. Just like that. The average temperature would be about 22 degrees Celsius. And the harmful cosmic rays that now penetrate our Earth would be cut off. They would be stopped by that canopy. And only the waves that were not harmful to man would come through. That's a scientific fact. That's what a water canopy would do. Now, what would be the results of a canopy like this? Well, first of all, minimal disease. My friend Dr. Colbar, Josephine and I have been over to see him, spoken to him quite a number of times on the phone. He set out to build the world's first hyperbaric biosphere. It's 62 feet long. It used to be an old submarine. And what he's trying to do is to simulate the environment of our original world. And he's placed a number of, that's him there. He's placed a number of creatures inside a small prototype first of all to try out what is going to happen. And among the things he put in the smaller one were 2 snakes. And before the snakes were placed into the biosphere, he milked their venom and examined it, and the venom looked like a lump of spaghetti altogether. After a period inside the biosphere, the snakes were milked again, and their venom still looked like spaghetti, but now the lumps were separated. And after a longer time, they were again milked, and their venom was examined, and now it looked like honeycomb. The disorder had been transformed into an order. That's what the extra oxygen content and the extra atmosphere did. Now, Dr. Barr believes that in the atmosphere of the original world, a snake bite would give an injection of protein and not poison. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Now, what about mosquitoes? Okay. Mosquitoes today are not very pleasant, are they? In the pre-flood world, there was enough nutrition in the plant material for mosquitoes to be fed nutritionally without having to attack human beings. The only reason they attack us today is because they can't get the nutrition that used to be that they needed. And there's a mosquito taking up blood in you. I'm sure we've all experienced something to do with that. Now something else. A denser, heavier atmosphere would be the result of the canopy, and also increased oxygen. And that would virtually eliminate disease. Ageing would have been slowed down to almost nothing. And that would explain the long lives of the people before the flood. So the canopy would also not only contribute to minimal disease, but also rapid healing. Now, down in the Red Sea a few years ago, a ship was sent to do some work, and they lowered a man in a bathysphere into the water, and he was exploring the seabed. Accidentally, he cut himself, and it was bleeding pretty badly, and so he wanted to come back up. They said, well, because the pressure is too strong, you'll suffer bad effects if we try to bring you up too fast. So he tied himself around with a bandage, and remember, inside the bathysphere there's compressed oxygen. The next morning when they brought him up, it had almost healed. It was well on the way to being perfectly healed, just by the increased pressure of oxygen into the cells of his body from being inside that bathysphere. So it seems that in the event of an injury, the pre-flood atmosphere served to promote faster healing. Now here is a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. I know they're using one in the city of Midland in Texas, where they were when we were there, and there are a few places around the world now that are starting to use this pressurised oxygen treatment to heal people quicker. Now, the next thing that a canopy would do for the planet would be greater stamina and endurance. Today's atmospheric pressure is 14.7 pounds per square inch at sea level. But before the flood, from an analysis of ancient air bubbles trapped in amber, it appears that there was about 27 pounds per square inch of atmospheric pressure in the past, about twice what there is now in our atmosphere. And the great dinosaurs, with their small lungs and tremendous height, could hardly survive today at that size. Now, C.S. Morris could reach his head almost 70 feet, that's 7 stories high from the ground up into the air. What an enormous animal. But to do that, he would need greater oxygenation of the cells of his body. Otherwise, he could not survive. Now, when atmospheric pressure is doubled, the entire blood plasma is saturated right through your body with oxygen. And if you had such a heavy concentration of oxygen today, you know you could run 320 kilometres without getting tired. Incredible. Okay. Now what else would a canopy do? It would provide a continual food growing season. Also, it would provide larger specimens of some plants and many animals like fish and reptiles that keep growing as long as they live. That would account for the fact that dinosaurs and other creatures are so big. Essentially everything today that we find in its fossil form, however, that's alive today is also bigger as a fossil. For example, sheep were as big as horses in the past. We found fossil sheep that big. We found dragonflies with a 2-metre wingspan. Just give you a few other examples. Kangaroos, before the flood, were as big as that compared with present-day humans. Lobsters, compared with present-day man, were that big. Imagine going down to the beach and seeing a lobster as big as yourself. Imagine an alligator as big as a house, with its head as tall as the ceilings of the house. snails of 30 centimetres across. Sheep, as I said, as big as today's horses. 60-foot dinosaur, 18.5 metres long, could go up and poke his head into the spouting of a two-storey house and just drink the water out of it quite easily. In the original world, we had 30% oxygen in this atmosphere. Today's world has 21%. When oxygen concentration is increased, it encourages larger size. And we do find, friends, that from all over the world, skeletons, artefacts, fossil footprints, houses, and tombs have been discovered of the past world, which show that men and women were massive compared with men and women today. And very little must have scared them. They must have had huge engineering ideas because they were stronger and bigger themselves. Here is a man, modern day man, putting his foot beside the footprint of a pre-flood man. Here is something that was dug up in Turkey, and this was put on the counter of the hotel we stayed at in Dubai, near the Noah's Ark site. This is a pre-flood skull. You could put your head inside it. Human skull. There's another one. Compared with a modern-sized human jaw of the same size. When I say skull, that's a jaw, not a skull. Part of the skull. So there's a comparison of size. Here is one in Saudi Arabia. This man has uncovered. This was uncovered actually 3 or 4 years ago, and the evolutionists tried to suppress it. They came up with some fake pictures to discredit this one. This is the genuine one. And this man was enormous. He was almost 6 metres long. Here I am standing in Australia beside a plaster cast of a mummified man that was found in a swamp over in Ireland a few years ago. And his mummy was placed up in a railway station in London for several years. Look at the size difference. That's a genuine, life-size replica of a real man that lived in the past. And so we have a difference from way back there in the past to man and woman today. So when the book of Genesis tells us that, who'd like to read that verse, please? Emma. Thank you. We know it's recording truth, not fantasy. Now, a Japanese physicist, Dr. Kimori of Keio University in Tokyo, exposed plant life to 2 of the pre-flood conditions. And he grew tomato plants under a plastic dome which filter the ultraviolet rays just as the canopy used to do before the flood. And he increased the carbon dioxide, which also was a feature of the air before the flood. And he grew this tomato tree that you're seeing there. It's not a very good picture, but it's the best one I could get hold of. This tomato tree grew over 30 feet, 10 metres high. Imagine a tomato plant 10 metres high. What could we do here, Roger, if we had that kind of atmosphere? With more than 13,000 ripe tomatoes in the 6 months it was on display at the Japan Expo in 1985. Just imagine that. 13,000 tomatoes from one plant over 6 months. How long does a tomato plant live today? Just think what your strawberries are going to do if you're grown. You can put a dome like that over it. The tomato plant just didn't want to die. Okay. So not only did things grow bigger, pre-flood atmosphere contributes to longer life. You see, it's all very scientific as well as biblical. Bible and true science work together so beautifully. Here is the flood, right here. This is before the flood, this is after the flood. And here are the biblical ages of all the patriarchs as given in the Bible. And you notice how there was a great drop, a sudden drop after the flood. Because the pre-flood conditions no longer existed. There were other factors involved also in longevity, like God gave permission to eat meat after the flood because their vegetation would take a long time to grow. But he said also that one result would be the shortening of human life. Now, atmospheric pressure. This protective water canopy, we noted that the atmospheric pressure and the oxygen content were both greater. But do we have evidence that this was so? Well, yes, in Texas, in a layer of sandstone was found a petrified hammer. This hammer was analysed in the Battelle laboratories in Columbus, Ohio, in the USA. And the hammer proved to consist of the hammerhead, 96.6% iron, 0.74% sulphur, and 2.6% chlorine. Now, this may mean nothing to you until we understand that under today's atmospheric condition, you cannot compound chlorine with iron today. The only atmosphere that you would do it in would be atmosphere that had more oxygen, exactly as we know it was before the flood. Therefore, we have physical evidence here of what the oxygen was like before the flood. And it can be done only in the absence of ultraviolet radiation, which we know was a fact because of the canopy protecting the Earth. Shortwave UV filters rays were filtered out, and the atmosphere was stronger because of the canopy, and we believe the canopy was about 11 miles above the Earth. That's about 18, 19 kilometres above the Earth. Now, the oxygen ratio was then 30% compared with 22, 21% today. Also, the carbon dioxide ratio was 2% as against 0.035% today. Now, at night time, it was not totally dark. You equate it to dark, or have you ever been? You know somebody that is? On these dark Earth nights sometimes it can get rather scary. But back there, before the flood, the energy of the sun upon the hydrogen in the water canopy during the day would cause a gentle pink glow. When it was night on this side of the planet, there would be a transfer of energy from the day side of the Earth along the curved lines of the canopy, and the result would be a twilight glow on the night side of the Earth. Never totally dark. Now, there would be a certain effect of this pink glow. Biologists have found that under pink light, the greatest plant growth is encouraged. People respond in mood to pink light. And in the pre-flood world, the various spectra of light predominated, with a gentle pink glow day and night. Tranquility of the environment contributed to man's brain working at maximum efficiency. Not only that, but the invisible canopy formed a huge orbital lens. And an observer on Earth would look through the canopy, which was invisible, look at the stars, and they would appear larger than they do today, and closer, with more colour. Very beautiful. Now, how the Earth was heated is another interesting factor. The heating of the environment was from a gentle thermal blanket within the Earth itself. Radioactive elements now in the sedimentary rocks since the flood were once inside the Earth before the flood. There was a nuclear interior with radioactive material very finely balanced, and this ensured a lasting forever of the warmth that was coming from the interior. Now let's have a look at the sequence of layers here. The firmament, the canopy furthest out. Below that was the atmosphere, and then the Earth's crust. and the centre was the Earth's core, and then a little further out were controlled radioisotopic elements, balanced with moderator elements. And then, of course, there was the great deep on the edge of that, mentioned in the Bible. Now, we might wonder what the cause of the great flood was, what this great disaster that ended that great world was before the flood. Eric, would you like to tell us what the book of Genesis says about this place?
It eventually came to pass, and men began to multiply in the face of the earth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And as it was in the day of Noah, so shall it also be in the days of the Son of Man.
Thank you. Now, first of all, the book of Genesis does mention a population explosion. You'll notice when men began to multiply on the earth. Now, previously, they had been adding their population. Then there came a time when the population began to run out of control, multiply, just like it is today. Up till 1860, we believe that the population was fairly constant, just adding slightly, very moderately increasing. And yet, between 1860 and today, in about 150 years, it's been multiplying. It's multiplied from 500,000 or 600,000, 600 million people up to about 6.5 billion. Now that's multiplying. High technology, the Bible talks about metallurgy industry and various other things 300 years before the flood. Our industrial revolution began about 300 years ago also. Interesting, it's almost uncanny. The Bible talks about corruption and violence. Today we have that same thing happening in the world, don't we? Okay. Overpopulation, great industry, and knowledge. In fact, the knowledge of DNA, I believe, was well controlled and well manipulated before the flood. There's evidence of genetic manipulation before the flood. And the Bible talks about animals and man being corrupted. And this is a genetic manipulation of a creature that's alive today. Part human, part animal. We're having the same things happening. And violence. Until today, people are wondering, why doesn't God step in and do something? Well, God told Noah he was going to intervene. He wouldn't stand by forever and let man corrupt the earth. Becoming so dangerous that those that were faithful would not have a chance to survive if God did not intervene. And so he told Noah to get ready and build a survival vessel and warn the people. And Noah told the people. And then the door was shut. Most of them thought it was a nonsense and they didn't want to believe it. You can just imagine that last week going by while Noah and his family were shut up in the boat. Things went on as usual. The mayor of Enoch City had just completed his new house. The river currents were gentle, calm as always, but tonight there was fear in the air because something started to happen. There was lightning. The earth was shaking. This had never happened before. A day had been going on like this, and the lightning was still leaping from earth to sky. And suddenly there was a fiendish crackling, scary. And throughout the country, top scientists were being asked, what's going to happen? What does all this mean? Could old Noah Lamechson be right after all? You know, Noah's father was Lamech. Okay. The experts spoke soothingly to the public. Oh yes, it's unusual, but there's quite a plausible explanation. In fact, we're having a high-level conference about this tomorrow. 28 days later, the world was dead. So what actually happened? Well, there's evidence that the tilting of the Earth's axis did occur suddenly, and this brought terrific stress upon the Earth's surface. The whole globe shuddered. Huge amounts of water were encased under the Earth's granite crust. Now this water began to heat rapidly. The heat added to the pressure, which added to heat. and more pressure. And in a matter of minutes, something had to give. The pressure build-up became enormous, and the granite crust of the earth exploded. Genesis says what? Who'd like to read that? Juliana?
The same day were all the fountains of the great deep watered up.
Thank you. At first there appeared a small crack which grew in both directions. At a speed of about 4 kilometres a second, yes, we can calculate this, following the path of least resistance, the crack began to move around the earth. It encircled the globe in about 8 minutes. Under great pressure, other cracks were opening up. As these great cracks joined, fire spat out of the earth. Volcanoes expelled deadly fumes. And in these brief 8 minutes, the earth was ripped into continents. They were not separated at this time, but they simply ripped apart at the seams. The separation took place after the flood. And now, with the radioactive balance under the earth disturbed, violent energy was released. Under enormous pressure, the water exploded through the granite crust. It was expelled with such force that narrow jets shot 70 miles into the sky, and they struck the canopy. And the Bible says, what? Who'd like to read that? Charles? Keep going. And the windows of heaven were open. That's right. The sides of those holes opened as windows, and the canopy began to collapse. The collapsing canopy poured down in such volume and force that the result was disastrous. The Bible says it fell continuously over the entire earth for 6 weeks, non-stop. Rain was pouring, blowing and crashing from the heavens. Skyscraper high waves, whipped up by screaming hurricanes, clawed at the mountains. It was at this time that these waters entered our present oceans. The water that would soon cover the earth was coming from 3 sources. 1, the underground water basins. 2, the firmament canopy. And 3, thousands of new volcanoes. Did you know that gaseous products from volcanoes consist of 80% water vapour? In just 100 days, Mount Etna, Sicily, from just one cone, expelled 19 million litres a day of water. That's 1,900 million litres of water were expelled from one volcano in 100 days. Now you imagine 30,000 volcanoes, which seems to be the figure, exploding at the same time, at the time of the flood. How much water was released by the volcanic action? Now, all over the world today, we have 600 legends from all the different races about the Great Flood. All of these back up the Bible story of Genesis. When you consider that this is a foreign thing for God to do, to destroy the earth that He loved, that He created. You made something very, very beautiful, and somebody comes to destroy it. It would hurt you to have to wipe the whole thing and start again, wouldn't it? And God must have had His heart broken. It was out of love. He had made this world. He had made the people in it. He had made everything. He'd given us laws to live by. Laws of love, which if we keep them, we would survive and we'd be happy and safe. If we broke them, we would die. Man turned his back on God and death came into the human race. And so death passed upon all men, for the all have sinned. And we found ourselves in the death cell. Well, all of us are in the death cell. We all know we've got to die one day, unless Jesus comes first. And so we're all on death row, so to speak. But because He loves us so much, Jesus just couldn't stand by and leave us without hope. He came down and suffered the penalty of our wrongs so that we could be opened to life again. What a wonderful gift. And he offers us that now. He just asks us to put our faith in him, live by his rules, love him as much as we love ourselves and more. And friends, whatever comes in the future, we know that there may be great disasters coming in the future. We know that we don't have to fear those. They're only signs that the end's coming near again. The end is pointing at you and me. And he asks us to put our trust in him and start doing what he says, because he wants us to be saved in the new world. He wants people who can trust in that new world. People that he knows will want to live with him and live for him. They're the only people he can trust not to make up this world again. So he's creating a new world. He wants to make you and I new people so that we can be trusted to be in his new world with him. Does that make sense? Well, I guess that's the message that we need to think about this afternoon, isn't it? God loves you, cares about you, and he's planning a new world for you. Let's get ready for the words. God bless you.